Okay, we are starting with the revision for segment 3, levy and collection under GST. So in this basically we have 9 subsection 3 which deals with goods or services which are covered under RCM. So whenever you are referring to section 9 subsection 3, you should also give the reference to notification number 4 of 2017, and whenever we are giving reference to services, it should be notification 13 2017. So goods RCM is covered under notification 4 2017, service RCM is given under notification 13 2017. This is section 9 subsection 3. The general rule says that the liability to pay GST to government is on the supplier. Only in case of notified cases, the liability will be on some other person. So as per 9.3, for these notified goods and services, recipient will pay. As well as for 9.4, in case of promoter or builder who is making purchase from an unregistered person, then also RCM, recipient will be paying GST. Whereas in case of 9.5, there are some notified services through e-commerce operator, liability to pay GST is on that e-commerce operator. So this is the coverage of this particular chapter. In this you can see here 9.3, 9.4, 9.5, what is the comparative difference when applicable. 9.3 is applicable in case of notified goods or notified services. 9.4 is applicable in case of inward supplies by a registered person from an unregistered person. 9.5 is notified services through e-commerce operator. So what are being notified? For 9.3 we have notified goods and notified services. Goods notification 4 2017, service notification 13 of 2017. 9.4 what is notified? Only one transaction is notified, that is promoter or builder who is making purchase from an unregistered person. Basically promoter or builder who is engaged in residential real estate projects, because in case of commercial projects the rate of GST will be 12% or 18% with ITC. So therefore this 9.4 is not applicable there. 9.4 is applicable only in case of residential real estate projects where the rate of GST will be 1.5% or 7.5% without ITC. Then 9.5 about 4 notified services, that is HATE, H for housekeeping services, and A for accommodation services, T for transportation of passengers, E for eating food from restaurant. So housekeeping, example urban company, then accommodation Goa, Bebo, Oyo, etc. Transportation Ola, Uber, eating food from restaurants Swiggy or Zomato. Then who will pay GST? For 9.3 liability to pay GST is on recipient, 9.4 also recipient, 9.5 e-commerce operator will pay. Then how the supplier should be? In case of 9.3 the supplier may or may not be registered. In case of 9.4 the supplier should be unregistered, then only it will be coming under RCM. 9.5 in case of housekeeping service and accommodation service, first two cases the supplier should be registered. If the supplier is registered, it is not at all notified for 9.5, supplier only will pay GST. Whereas the next two cases T and E, the liability to pay GST is on e-commerce operator whether the supplier is registered or unregistered. Then we are moving on to 9.3, list of goods which are covered under RCM. So you need to remember, first the supplier is an agriculturist and the recipient is registered. What if the recipient is unregistered? Then it will not come under RCM, it will be FCM. So if they are registered they will pay GST, otherwise there won't be any GST. There is no compulsory registration here. It is like if the recipient is registered then only it will come under RCM. 9 subsection 3, notified goods under RCM, supplier should be agriculturist and recipient should be registered. Total 4 products: raw cashew nuts, raw cotton, tobacco leaves, tendu leaves. Then supplier is unregistered and the recipient is registered. Only 2 products, one is metal scrap. So that metal scrap is the latest amendment. Supplier is an unregistered person and the recipient is a registered person. Suppose if both are unregistered, first of all there is no GST. Suppose supplier is registered, then TDS will come, because we have an amendment there wherein supplier also registered, recipient also registered. It will be TDS in case of metal scrap. So therefore it is not RCM, it will be FCM only. And supplier is unregistered, recipient is registered, essential oils other than those of citrus fruit and metal scrap. These are the 2 products. Supplier is government and the recipient is registered. Then in that case we have lottery tickets, used vehicles or used goods or confiscated goods or seized goods. In that case it will be recipient who will pay. All other transactions, we have 2 points: silk yarn by silk yarn manufacturer to a registered person, and PSLC by registered person to another registered person, that is priority sector lending certificates. So these are the list of goods under RCM. And supply of metal scrap by registered person to another registered person is not covered under RCM, it will be FCM only. However, the said transaction is notified for TDS under section 51, where the recipient is required to deduct TDS at the rate of 2% on the payment made to the supplier. So the rate of TDS is 2%. Agriculturist, what if supplier is unregistered? Supplier is unregistered, TDS is not applicable, and RCM, liability to pay GST, is on recipient. Who is an agriculturist? Agriculturist means an individual or a HUF, only individual or HUF, engaged in cultivation of land either on own or through family members or hired labor. So if the agriculturist is any other person, then it will not coming under RCM, it will be FCM only. Wherever it is FCM, simple. If they are registered, they will pay GST. If they are not registered, they will not pay GST, but the charge will not change. The charge will be FCM only. Then, as per section 23, an agriculturist who is exclusively engaged in exempted supplies, he is not required to get registered, and they are exempted from registration. Agriculturist is exempted from registration provided they are exclusively engaged in supply out of cultivation of land. And what is the connection between RCM and the TDS provisions related to metal scrap? There is a supply of metal scrap falling under heading 72 to 81, that is all kind of metal scrap is covered, let it be copper or zinc or iron ore or steel, all kind of metal scrap. Suppose if it is by registered person, to registered person, both are registered, so it will be FCM, and TDS also will be applicable, whereas supplier registered, recipient is unregistered. So then in that case it will be FCM, but TDS is not applicable because the recipient is an unregistered person. Then supplier is unregistered, so definitely TDS not applicable. Recipient is registered, so RCM will be applicable. If recipient also unregistered, GST not applicable, TDS also not applicable. Then some important points in this regard: the maximum rate of GST is 40%. In that CGST will be 20%, SGST 20%, and generally GST payable to government by the supplier. But in these 939495, then only RCM or any other person will pay. Therefore, if it is supply, if a supply is not covered in 939495, then it is always forward charge mechanism. Whenever it is 95, don't call it as RCM. It is supply by like supply through e-commerce operator will pay. That will not be called as RCM liability of the e-commerce operator. If a supply is covered under RCM, recipient is not exonerated from payment of GST if supplier discharges the liability. So the transaction is covered under RCM, so recipient should pay, but the supplier has paid. So whether recipient has to really pay, yes, recipient has to pay and the supplier should get the refund. In such case, recovery of tax can be initiated by department on recipient for non-payment of GST. Then GST under RCM is always payable using the electronic cash ledger. So RCM liability cannot be discharged through electronic credit ledger, it should be electronic cash ledger. Then notified services under notifications 13 of 2017. So it is Sir CG got salads, and here we have S for security lending. Related to security lending, there is a lender of securities and borrower of securities. We don't have any exemptions in this regard, no conditions, and no non-applicability of RCM means exception to RCM. So always recipient only will pay. Then import of services. For import of services, we have two exemptions. Import of services by other than non-taxable online recipient or non-taxable online recipient, nothing. It is actually other than OIDR services. So exemption is only for other than OIDR services by non-taxable recipient. Non-taxable recipient already we know in exemptions, that is individual, trust, government. Individual unregistered for any purpose, that is personal purpose, and trust, charitable trust for charitable activities, then government for non-business purpose. So that is the meaning. Import of service other than OIDR by non-taxable recipient, then import of services by an Indian establishment of a foreign airline company, provided there is a reciprocal arrangement or reciprocal agreement wherein the foreign establishment of Indian airline company is given a exemption, similar exemption. So import of service by Indian establishment of a foreign airline company without consideration, where Ministry of Civil Aviation certifies that there is a reciprocal agreement between India and foreign country. And we don't have any condition for RCM, but non-applicability of RCM in case of import of other than, that is import of OIDR services by non-taxable online recipient. Who is non-taxable online recipient? Any unregistered person importing the services, or registered person who is registered only for the purpose of deducting TDS. Then renting of motor vehicles. For exemption, motor vehicle that can carry more than 12 passengers to a state road transport undertaking, renting of electric motor vehicle that can carry more than 12 passengers to a local authority, and motor vehicle that can carry goods to a GTA, and motor vehicle which is bus given on rent to a person who in turn provides transportation services to education institution up to 12th standard or equivalent. See, this particular test 2, again questions will be there on exemptions also. Okay. Then next, condition for RCM. 3 conditions should be satisfied: supplier other than body corporate, recipient body corporate, rate of GST 5%. If any one condition is not satisfied, then it will be coming under FCM. Then renting of immovable property, we have an amendment. If it is a residential property, we have 2 exemptions. So that is renting of residential property for residential purpose to an unregistered person, or renting of residential property for residential purpose to a registered individual for their family stay. And condition for RCM, only one condition: recipient should be registered. And whether renting is for residential purpose or commercial purpose, if the recipient is registered, it will be RCM. And renting of residential property for commercial purpose to an unregistered person will be FCM. Suppose if it is residential property, anyhow it is exempted, whereas commercial property we have one exemption. If it is accommodation services, continuous period of 90 days, minimum 90 days, subject to maximum 20,000 rupees per month per member, and this exemption is applicable even in case of residential property. What is the condition for RCM? For commercial property, they have given condition: supplier should be unregistered and recipient is registered. Suppose if the supplier is registered, it will be covered under FCM. Then copyright services, original literary, dramatic, musical, artistic works. In all these cases, supplier will be individual and the recipient can be any person. Liability to pay GST under RCM, we don't have any exemption, no condition. However, in case of original literary, there is an option. The author has option to pay GST under FCM. From the date of selecting option, next 1 year, the author only will pay GST under FCM. If author opts to pay GST under FCM, lock-in period 1 year from the date of exercising the option. Then GTA services. For GTA services, we have 3 exemptions: notified goods, 6 notified goods, agricultural produce, food grains including flours, pulses, milk and salt, organic manure, newspapers and magazines, relief material for natural and man-made disasters, defense and military equipment. And number 2, if the recipient is individual, HUF, AJP or a trust, and if they are unregistered and they are not having the factory, or if the recipient is registered only for the purpose of deducting TDS. So in these cases it is exempted, other case it will be taxable. And GTA also has the option to pay GST under FCM if they select the option. That option should be selected between January 1st to March 31st of the previous financial year, and that option selected will be throughout this financial year. And they have 2 rates under FCM: 12% with ITC, 5% without ITC. And if it is 12% means they can take ITC on their inward supply. If it is 5%, they cannot take ITC on their inward supply. However, the recipient who is paying this 12% or 5% can definitely take ITC. Whereas if the RCM option is selected, always it will be on the recipient and the 5% will be the rate. If the question is silent, we need to go for RCM option. Only if the question specifies that they have opted for FCM, it will be FCM. Then next, government services to business entities. It also includes services provided by parliament or state legislature, court or tribunal to business entities. In case of court or tribunal, other than legal services, all other services are covered under supply. Only legal services are excluded from supply. And here we have some specific exemptions: RTI charges, right to information tax charges, interdepartmental service. So all these 14 specific exemptions and 2 general exemptions we know in exemptions itself. Now what is extra that you need to remember? Condition for RCM, we don't have any condition for RCM. Non-applicability of RCM, in few cases RCM will not be applicable, it will be always FCM. What is that? In case of renting of immovable property to an unregistered business entity, and in case of supply of goods by Indian Railways, goods or services by Indian Railways, then Department of Post, then transportation of goods or passengers, services by port or airport. These 5 cases, don't check, it will not be RCM, it will be always FCM. Other than these 5, all other services provided by government to business entity will be covered under RCM. Then overseeing committee services to RBI. So in this case, we don't have any condition for RCM. And exemptions, non-applicability of RCM, always GST payable by RBI. T for transferable development rights, TDR, FSI and long-term lease. In this case, we have an exemption with respect to proportionate inward supply used in construction of residential units which are booked before completion certificate of first occupation, whichever is earlier. So the exemption will be value of inward supply into 18% into, so area of residential units booked before completion certificate or first occupation, whichever is earlier, divided by total carpet area of the project. That is a proportionate exemption. We don't have any condition for RCM and non-applicability of RCM. Then sponsorship services. In case of sponsorship services, sponsorship of a recognized sporting event is exempted. Recognized sporting event, we have a sporting event organized by recognized sports body, that is National Sports Federation, Inter-University Sports Board, Paralympic Committee, Central Civil Services, Cultural and Sports Board, Indian Olympic Association and Panchayat Sports Board. And any other sponsorship will be taxable, and in case of sponsorship, if the recipient is body, corporate or firm, it will be covered under RCM. If the recipient is other than body, corporate or firm, it will be FCM. And for the purpose of GST, LLP should not be brought under body, corporate. LLP will be treated as firm. So therefore, anyhow here body, corporate or firm is given. Then agent services. In case of agent services, first point is insurance agent to insurance company. Suppose if the insurance agent is a business facilitator or business correspondent working in rural area, then it will be exempted, no condition for RCM and no exceptions to RCM. Then recovery agent. Remember, recovery agent should be providing service to a bank, financial institution or NBFC. We don't have any exemption with respect to that, and no condition for RCM, non-applicability of RCM. Direct selling agent. Again, direct selling agent will be providing services to banking company or NBFC. We don't have any exemption, but there is a condition for RCM. Supplier should be other than body, corporate or firm. Suppose if the supplier is body, corporate or firm, it will be covered under FCM. Then business facilitator to banking company, we have an exemption, that is if the business facilitator is working in rural area, then it will be exempted, otherwise it will be taxable, and we don't have any conditions or non-applicability. Agent of business correspondent to business correspondent. So again, agent of business correspondent earning commission in rural area is exempted, no condition for RCM, non-applicability of RCM. Then legal services provided by individual advocate or firm of advocates to business entity. We have 4 exemptions. Number 1, if they are providing services to a person other than business entity, it is exempted. If they are providing services to individual, that is individual advocate or firm of advocate, it is exempted. If they are providing services to government, that is government, central government, state government, local authority, government authority or government entity, it is exempted. If they are providing services to a person, that is business entity, whose turnover during the previous year does not exceed threshold limit, 4 case it is exempted. However, that second point, that is individual advocate or firm of advocate point, is not applicable to senior advocate. So services provided by senior advocate to another individual advocate or firm of advocate, we need to see the ultimate litigant, applicant or petitioner as the recipient, and we don't have any condition for RCM, non-applicability of RCM. Arbitrator providing services to a business entity, 3 exemptions we have. If they provide service to other than business entity, exempted. If they are providing services to government, central government, state government, local authority, government authority or government entity, it is exempted. If they are providing services to a business entity whose turnover during previous year does not exceed threshold limit, it is exempted, other case it will be taxable. We don't have any condition for RCM, non-applicability of RCM. Then director. There is a director who is providing services to a company or body corporate, and in this regard we have one point. If the director is an employee of the company, it is not a supply, it is excluded from supply. So for that purpose we need to check TDS under section 192 or 194. If it is TDS under section 192, then it is a salary employee, and therefore director service will not come under supply. If it is TDS under 194J, then the money received will be PGBP or IFOS, and therefore it will be supply, and liability to pay GST is on the company and company or body corporate. So then we don't have any condition for RCM. However, there is a non-applicability of RCM, even though it becomes supply, if the director is providing services in his personal capacity, personal private capacity, then we should not treat it as director service, we should apply the other points. Then security agency services to a registered person. So in this case we have an exemption, that is if the security agency service is provided to an education institution providing education up to 12th standard or equivalent, so then it will be exempted. And we have 2 conditions for RCM. Supplier should be other than body corporate, and recipient should be registered but not opting for composition scheme, and not registered only for deducting TDS. If any one condition is not satisfied, then it will be covered under FCM. Then purchases from an unregistered person, section 9 subsection 4. 9(4) is applicable in case of a promoter or builder who is making purchases from an unregistered person. What we need to check, first point is that we need to see capital goods. If the capital goods are purchased from a registered person, ignore, no need to pay GST under RCM. But if the capital goods are purchased from an unregistered person, then they need to pay GST under RCM, at the rate applicable to capital goods. And in case of cement, purchase from registered person, no need to pay any GST under RCM, but if it is from unregistered person, they need to pay GST under RCM at the rate of 28%. 9 subsection 4. Balance inputs and input service from unregistered person divided by total inputs and input services. While doing the total inputs and input services, 5 things should be excluded, that is petrol, diesel, then natural gas, so electricity, TDR, FSI and long term lease. So remaining you need to see what is the percentage. If the percentage is less than or equals to 20%, means purchase from unregistered person not more than 20%, so therefore they don't have to pay GST under RCM. If it exceeds 20%, which means purchase from unregistered person more than 20%, but allowed is only 20%, so on that excess amount they need to pay GST under RCM at 18%. And here this needs to be verified with respect to each financial year. It is not with respect to each month, it is with respect to each financial year. And also, so this payment has to be discharged at the time of filing the annual return. Next one, 9 subsection 5, liability to pay GST on e-commerce operator in case of notified services. So for notified services, HATE, housekeeping services, that is example urban clap quicker etc., supplier should be unregistered. If the supplier is registered, it is not covered under 9.5, so supplier only pay GST. A for accommodation services, example Goa, Bibo, Make My Trip etc., supplier should be unregistered. But if the supplier is registered, then it will be covered under FCM. That is supplier only will pay GST. T for transportation of passengers by any motor vehicle. So this includes all kind of motor vehicles, let it be 4-wheelers or bus, everything will be covered here, Ola, Uber, Red Bus, Rapido. Other than by omnibus, capacity more than 6 passengers, not exactly 6 passengers, capacity greater than 6 passengers by a company, then it is not covered under 9.5. So therefore generally transportation of passengers by any motor vehicle, so liability to pay GST is on e-commerce operator, let the supplier be registered or unregistered. However, if that is by a company and that too in omnibus, then it will be covered under FCM, so supplier only will pay GST, e-commerce operator will not pay GST. If the transportation is through omnibus by a company, then E for eating food from restaurant, so Swiggy, Zomato etc., let the supplier be registered, unregistered, e-commerce operator will pay. However, if the restaurant is in the specified premises, what is the specified premises? So the hotel where the tariff is more than 7,500 rupees per day or equivalent, any one room, then in that hotel there is a restaurant which is supplying through Swiggy, Zomato, liability to pay GST is on the restaurant only, that is the hotel or the restaurant only. If the restaurant is in the specified premises, that is in a hotel having declared tariff greater than 7,500 rupees per day. And important points you can see, when e-commerce operator is liable to pay GST on above services, they are not required to deduct TCS. Okay, and here we need to remember that section 9 subsection 5 and section 52 are mutually exclusive. The concept of TCS is applicable only for e-commerce operator, but that e-commerce operator who is not covered under 9 subsection 5. If the e-commerce operator is covered under 9 subsection 5, then TCS is not applicable and the rate of TCS is now amended as 0.5%, that is 0.25% CGST and 0.25% SGST. And as this portion is only about charge under CGST Act, so the TDS TCS provisions will not be tested here, but the connecting provisions of TDS TCS can be tested. Only in case of notified services, e-commerce operator is liable to pay GST. In other cases, supplier shall pay GST and e-commerce operator shall pay GST on the commission. So therefore, whenever e-commerce operator is not paying GST under 9.5, at least on the commission they will be paying GST. Every e-commerce operator who is liable to pay GST or who is liable to deduct TCS is compulsorily required to get registered. Also, every supplier of goods through e-commerce operator is also compulsorily required to get registered. However, if they are making only intra-state supplies and not making through e-commerce operator in more than one state, they will obtain a unique enrollment number. Through that unique enrollment number, they can make supplies through e-commerce operator. This is in case of supply of goods. Every supplier of goods through ECO is compulsorily required to get registered. However, if such supplier is making only intra-state supply of goods, then they should register as and when aggregate turnover exceed threshold limit for registration. What about supplier of notified services? Supplier of notified service or supplier of other than notified service through e-commerce operator is required to get registered only when their aggregate turnover exceed threshold limit for registration. Suppose if they are notified service providers or other than notified service providers, always it is the same case. And if e-commerce operator is having physical place of business in India, then they will register. What if they don't have physical place of business? They should appoint, like we should check whether they have a representative. Then that representative will register and pay GST. If they neither have physical presence nor they have a representative in India, then in that case, so they should appoint a representative, and that representative shall register and pay GST. Apart from this, you need to also check that circular related to restaurant services. One circular is given, so that is there in the resource book that you need to see. So there are some key points, like in case of restaurant, so they have to pay GST on their direct supplies, and with respect to supplies through e-commerce operator will pay, and the rate of GST applicable for restaurant is 5%. So which means that 5% without ITC. Even though e-commerce operator is paying that 5%, they can take ITC on their inward supplies, but the restaurant only cannot take ITC on their inward supplies. And generally e-commerce operator can make payment of GST through electronic credit ledger or electronic cash ledger. But in case of restaurant service through e-commerce operator, that e-commerce operator should pay GST only from the electronic cash ledger, not from the electronic credit ledger. Then these are other points. So with this charge under CGST is over.